All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today for the annual Knowledge Now Human Resources Conference. I am Shannon Latham with the Olathe Chamber, and I know many of you would recognize Susan Wallace. She previously held this position, and she took on another role at another company, and so this was turned over to me in the middle. And I just want to say I appreciate our moderator and panelists because they ran with this and will make me look like I know what I'm doing today. We have our moderator is Keely Schneider. She's the executive director of the Workforce Partnership. Our panelists are JT Galloway, the owner and chief cultural officer of CoCulture. Bryan Brazel, talent acquisition supervisor at TVH Parts Americas, and Andrea Allison-Putman, chief people and inclusion officer at the Greater Kansas City YMCA. I want to thank them all for joining us, and I want to thank real quick our sponsors, Garmin, Olathe Public Schools, Kansas State University Olathe, and Farmers Insurance. For everyone on here, we will be doing, there is a question and answer section, and you can throw your questions in there throughout, but we will get to them at the end of the discussion today. And if there's something that comes up closer to the end, feel free to just keep throwing your questions out there, and we will kind of get through those at the end if we can. So I want to go ahead and throw it over to Keely to get us started today.
Thank you, Shannon, and you've been doing a great job filling in for Susan Wallace. We do miss her, but wish her really the best in her new position. So good afternoon, or we're not quite afternoon, good morning. As you said, I'm Keely Schneider with Workforce Partnership. Excited to moderate this great panel. Got an opportunity over the last couple of weeks to get to know these folks, and I think we've got some really wonderful, detailed information that I hope you'll find very useful around corporate culture, how that can help elevate both performance as well as retention. And, it's really important, I think, particularly in the space right now where we have large swaths of our community are working from home. We have people who are feeling like, oh, they're the necessary required workers and they have to be on the front lines. And their job is, maybe not as protected health-wise as we'd like for it all to be. And so we've got some real challenges around culture right now. So it's really a very timely topic, I think. But before we sort of dive into the details and what really makes that corporate culture engine run, I wanted to just set the stage a little bit with some framing around the concept of culture in a corporation to begin with. Clearly I think most of us are very familiar with what we mean by culture when we're speaking about different countries and the culture and the food and all of that from different ethnicities. But what do we mean when we're talking culture as it relates to a corporation? That's such a corporation is truly a fictitious entity. It's not something tangible. So how do you create culture around something that you can't really touch or feel or taste, right? And really, when we talk about corporate culture, what we're talking about is the overall environment or attitude, if you will, that's in your workplace. And that experience is really based on a couple of things. It's both derived from the shared experiences that people already have had, whether those are employees or clients. That is one way that your corporate culture is derived out of those natural occurrences. But it also is something that guides. So culture is both created out of experience, but it also guides experience. So it's one of those things that helps guide how employees in your company act, how they interact with each other, how they think and feel. So it's really important to understand that your company has a unique personality. That's maybe one way to think of it, is it's truly the personality of your company and how that it expresses. Because our industries and our corporations are all so very different, right, from each other, there is not really a one-size-fits-all culture template. We're not here to tell you, well, here's your template, go forth and create this culture. The culture at Apple or Microsoft may be very, very different than what is accepted as really great culture for Bank of America, right? Or Garmin. So, these cultures are all different and they don't necessarily fit every employee. Some employees do better in some cultures than others. And those are personal preferences, right? But what we do want to get to is an understanding of why developing culture matters in our companies. And it's really important to note that there are a lot of studies out there that have shown that a strong corporate culture is actually one of the common denominators among the most successful companies. You see in those companies consensus at the top leadership around cultural priorities, as well as the priorities, of course, of the organization and its goals, right? These leaders really do go out of their way to be clear about the values of the company and how those values define their organization. Conversely, of course, if you don't have consensus around your culture, you can really bring down the organization. It could create disengaged employees, high turnover, of course, poor customer relations, lower profits, and these are all things that how a bottom line can be affected by either the absence of culture or perhaps negative corporate culture. I think one of the really compelling data points when I was sort of diving into this a little bit that I came across was that research studies showed that 2 out of 3 mergers, corporate mergers, fail, and because of cultural problems. So if you think about all the reasons why a corporate merger could fail, 2/3 of them fail because the cultures don't merge well. So that, I think, alone really demonstrates and underscores how important this is. And I want to make sure that we understand that corporate culture is also, it's not just the wages that you pay or the benefits you provide or even the perks, right? And a lot of people think of corporate culture as, oh, it's the perks I get for working in this cool environment. We have a coffee bar and we have a chill space and all of that. Yes, those things are a piece of the culture, but culture is deeper than that. It goes well beyond those physical attributes of our space and really includes those things such as the attitude of employees on the job and the treatment of your employees. That is what will, when you support and respect and value the efforts of your employees, that's when you're going to have that really big boost in employee retention. And I think that's what we're going to try today to really get down into is what does that look like beyond sort of the fancy outward appearance of corporate culture. HR, I think most of you out there, not all of you, but most of you, many of you are probably HR professionals or leadership in your organization. And truly, I think HR has maybe, for better or worse, HR has sort of the duty to caretake your organization's culture, right? That's sort of one of those things that we look to our human resource professionals for, and they're often called upon really to ensure that that corporate culture is intentionally developed and maintained and expressed, right? Through a variety of avenues, whether that's retention and recruitment and onboarding to corporate visioning or communications and around performance and rewards and recognition and so on. So that's what we're really going to try to dive into a little bit today, but I did want to sort of set the stage that positive corporate culture really is the lifeblood of your organization, and it really shouldn't be left to its own devices. And I think that our panelist conversation today will very much encourage you to intentionally work on this piece of your corporate attitude. And with that, I think what we're going to do is start with our panelists and really have them kick it off a little bit. We're going to ask them as they answer to share a little bit about themselves, just a quick little bio, and then talk to us a little bit about what they think are the factors of great corporate culture in a more general sense. But we're going to start with JT Galloway and have him lead us off.
Yeah, well, thank you, Keely. I feel like whenever you're talking about that great corporate culture, I feel like I could just like put you on repeat of what you just said for the past 10 minutes. Like, just here, go ahead. That's it. I'm JT. We'll go ahead and take off.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, got it. But so my name is JT Galloway. I am the Chief Culture Officer at CoCulture. Basically, what we do is we help companies be great places to work. And so we do that through focusing on organizational culture and employee well-being. And it is my joy and my privilege to be able to be in this field for a little over a decade. I've been really blessed to work with some amazing leaders where we got to, some really cool accolades where it's, Fortune's top 100 companies to work for, a Global Healthy Workplace Award, and numerous kind of just here in town type of awards as well. But it's been amazing just to be able to see what culture can do for an organization. Me personally, besides doing this work, I'm married. I have a wife. We have we have our first baby on the way that is due. A little baby girl we just found out here just a little over a week ago. So we have a little baby girl, the superior sex, if I do say so myself. So we're gonna, I'll call that out right quick. But we're really looking forward to that, and so that's gonna be my life here pretty soon. My life is about ready to drastically change. But within the world of culture, right? That question that you asked about what does even culture look like, right? It's hard to define. It really is. People can have different definitions of it. It looks different in every single company, right? Just like you were saying, something that is a great corporate culture at Google is definitely going to be different than at a blue collar company, right? Than ABC company. So a lot of the times, whenever we try and kind of just to frame it, maybe to get a little bit better of a grasp around it, sometimes I like to say it's not just how things are done around here, right? Just these are things. This is how we do things. But it's the why behind it, right? It's even the what, right? It's what makes us us. And so being able to have that, that shared purpose, those values, those mindsets, that behaviors, right? That's kind of looking at it whenever I say, oh, that's that type of culture that they have, right? It's not just exemplified, right, by the words and the deeds of leadership, but it's also amplified by them. So being able to look for, hey, what are they doing? Okay, well, that's kind of how things are done around here, right? It's evident in our rituals and our day-to-day, our stories, right? Even like the lore of our companies, right? Whenever we think of different companies here around town, man, I would love to work there, right? And none of us really even have that experience of actually working there. We've just heard of those stories, right? And it's really just, it's accentuated in not only that, but also being able to make positive changes in that within organizational practices and processes. So being able to set something up to where it's easier to say yes to the right choice rather than, keeping it from like, hey, well, you got to really fit within this box, right? And so trying to be able to play with that and make sure that works for everybody within the organization.
Awesome. Thank you so much, JT. And Andrea, I want to go to you next. You bring to this panel the not-for-profit perspective with YMCA. So if you don't mind introducing yourself a little bit and share with us your thoughts around what is great corporate culture or factors that contribute to that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Keely, and a special thank you also to Shannon and Susie from the Overland Park Chamber. Olathe Chamber. Really appreciate being part of this. And really, if I think about what JT said, I can agree with a lot of what he said as far as in relation to great culture. And I think every company is so different. And so I think that's why it's so important for people to understand a corporate culture and to select in or out of it. And so I think JT hit it right on the head. I've been in the human resource, communication, and community engagement arena for over 25 years. I've been with the Y now 9 years. And so I really enjoy serving at the Y. I serve as the Chief People and Inclusion Officer. So in that capacity, really, I'm responsible for how we engage our staff and volunteers in the mission of the Y. So again, I'm really happy to be with you. If I think about just the basic concept of a great culture, it really goes back to something that JT said, which sounds so elementary, but it's really true. It's really how organizations do things. But then it's really how people experience those things. And so how our employees or associates, however you refer to it, how they experience how the company does things really drives the culture and drives their behaviors. And then ultimately, like for us at the Y, it then really reciprocates into how our staff experience each other. And then also how we drive the impact with our community, whether it's our members, program participants, the kiddos we serve. And so if the culture is right for us, then everything is really going to go really well as it relates to how we serve others. So again, I'm just so happy to be a part of this panel and look forward to learning from each of you all on the call today.
Thanks, Andrea. And Bryan, now I'll turn to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your thoughts.
Keely. I'm Bryan Brazel. I'm the Talent Acquisition Supervisor for TVH. My background has been in executive search, headhunting, corporate recruitment, and architecture and engineering prior to TVH. And for those of you that don't know, TVH is a industrial equipment parts and accessories distributor. So I always look at culture through the lens of talent acquisition and talent retention. At TVH particularly, I think about what drives our culture, or where our culture comes from, is the history of the company and being family owned and having some roots in Europe, and even as a almost 7,000 person global organization, we still have that family feel to our culture. I think JT made a good point. Culture goes back to the why, but I think it also is the how. How you do anything is how you do everything. And so for us, it's how we operate day to day and what is our vision for the future, along with the history of the company. So for us, it's a very people-focused, people-centric organization. And I think that's always got to be a critical element when you're thinking about culture for your organization. Is it's driven by people and it affects people, whether it's your customers or your employees. I think that's really important to keep top of mind.
I love that. How we do anything is how we do everything. And I think that's a really good way to get us into sort of our next conversations, because we're going to be talking about, how culture can affect your bottom line. And there's so many things that go to a bottom line, right? It's not just the money you bring in, it's the expenses that go out, it's the people, it's the cost savings. But specifically around culture, I know we've had some conversations about employee retention, about employee engagement and so on, and how we're measuring that, right? And so I know really want to get into now the impact of culture on some more specific things, and maybe we talk first around this, employee engagement and productivity and so on. And I wanted Andrea to really share a little bit about what YMCA does around some engagement surveying and scoring. I thought that's some really interesting things that we've talked about, in fact, last week. So if you don't mind, Andrea, sharing a little bit about that.
Oh, great. Thanks, Keely. At the YMCA, we've actually been measuring, at least on an annual basis, and sometimes we even do pulse checks in some parts of throughout the year. But about 5-6 years ago, we actually shifted from doing satisfaction surveys to really move into what we call, what many refer to as Net Promoter Score, or NPS, as many people will shorten it. And so the focus is more on, actively understanding, would they refer someone to your organization, whether it's for, to work, which is probably more specifically, but I know in the service arena, many companies use NPS or Net Promoter Score to measure, customer and client engagement and how likely are they to refer. And so for us, it just made sense for us to really look at that engagement score, and then how it drives the engagement score of those that we serve. Again, program participants, families, and members. And so it really gives you an ideal of those triggers that are going to make individuals more loyal to your brand or more loyal to your culture. And so we look at that on an annual basis. I will say with COVID this year, we may not actually do a survey, but really we're building upon what we've done last year. And so we kind of know what are some of the drivers of what we do that actually will make a difference on enhancing that engagement score. Because in reality, we can't be all things to all people, and we know kind of the culture that we want to shape. And so we know that really work environment is a really key thing. So how we treat each other. I'm not for sure if it was JT or Bryan talked about values. And so, measuring how well are we doing on values? And so are we showing up as being caring, honest, respectful, and being responsible? Because that's core to the history of the Y. I mean, our YMCA is celebrating 160 years this year. And so these values are not new, and those values are still true and relevant to today. So how are we showing up, and how do we treat each other? And do we treat each other that way? We also look very closely at communication. We do know that communication is one of those things that could be a major distractor, not just with their peer group, but especially with their supervisors and getting the information they need in order to do their job well. Our associates really take pride in what they do, and we know that communication could be a barrier to them really showing up the way they want to. The next one, and I think, this is probably, it could be unique to nonprofits or it could be unique to the Y, but I doubt if it is, but being recognized for a job well done. And the reality is people want to be recognized in different ways. And so we really look at that, personal and professional milestones that people want to be recognized for. And how do they want to be recognized? We do know that some people are motivated by dollars. Some people are motivated by public recognition. Others don't recognize me in public. Just help me get my job done. That's also a form of recognition. And then the last one, which, what I've seen, and I think Society of Human Resource Management, the national group, has really elevated this more, especially as there's been turbulence in our community. And of course it continues even in 2020 with the impact of COVID and other social unrest, but pay and total rewards are continuing to get elevated up. And many times in the nonprofit sector, we do not pay at the same level as our for-profit counterparts. But again, that's part of being engaged in a nonprofit position. But we do know that being paid in an equitable and fair way, but then pay for the value of that job is pretty important, as well as total rewards. And so those are the 4 things that we focus on the Y. I mean, there's a lot of other things we could, but those are pretty big buckets. And we focus on those for the last 4 years to continue to drive that engagement score.
I love that, Andrea. That's some great detail there. And just to sort of quickly recap, there are kind of 4 buckets, if you will, that you guys measure in a surveying, whether that's survey or pulse checks with your employees, and they're around how we treat each other, around communications, both at the peer level and between supervisor and supervisee, recognition, not just do we recognize, but are we recognizing people in the way they're accepting the recognition, right? That feels good to them. And also pay and total rewards. I think those are really great points to take away. These are ways that you can help drive your culture and also learn from your culture. What is your culture right now? What are your employees telling you that they're experiencing? Because that's real, I think that's just really great information. And I want to now kind of switch gears into our for-profit world and talk to Bryan a little bit about retention and, I meant to say recruitment and onboarding, because this is another area where your corporate culture really is very public, how you recruit people. So tell us a little bit about what TVH does, Bryan, around this, to kind of share what they're about. I think you're muted there, Bryan. Not a problem.
There it goes. Good points, Andrea. I think especially on recognition and values, and what TVH does from day one, and we try to communicate this in our employer branding. But we start a conversation the very first interview with someone that's going to lead to how they experience their entire employment, hopefully for years to come with TVH. So really setting the tone and explaining our values. For us, it's group, goal, soul, power, spirit. What do those things mean to a potential new member of our organization, and trying to get some examples from them out of it. What does that look like day to day in the organization? And is that a good fit culturally? So we also use our values in our performance management. So we have, goals for employees they're tracked and measured annually, but we also want to see, what are you doing to contribute to those values in the organization? What are you doing to exemplify those as you complete your goals and tasks and projects? So one's just as important as the other for us in terms of that. And back to what you said about setting the tone, I think for me, every hire we make is a new strand in the DNA of our company, and that's going to impact the culture with a ripple effect. So looking for an employee to have a really good experience, we start them with a buddy in our buddy program, usually someone from another department, so they get a perspective outside of the group of people that they're working with day to day. What is the company culture like beyond just a small group of people in my department? Talking about some of the things we do with our welcome days, and we have a full day program for new employee orientation. It seems a bit much for some people, but we like to get them a tour of the full facility, talk about some career progression that people in the company have had, so they understand from day one that this is a journey, not a stagnant role that you're performing with the company. At the risk of sounding like a quote machine, I'll leave you another one, but they say retention is a new recruitment. So the more people that you can keep in your company, the more people you can keep moving forward. And then back to what Andrea said with the Net Promoter Score, one of our biggest sources for new hires is employer referrals. So we really do lean heavily on people absorbing our culture and expressing that back out to the community.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that as you were describing, Bryan, your approach to both recruitment and sort of that onboarding process, right? There's a welcome day. You get a buddy or a mentor and someone that you get to see beyond just your maybe cohort in your department, right? You get to see the rest of the company. It made me feel like you guys are like the recruiters for a university. And that's probably what's on my mind now because I have a rising senior in high school. And, it's like, it's the welcome day. And, that is a wonderful way to sort of celebrate the onboarding of a new person in your organization. And I love that you make that time to do that with individuals and to show them from the outset, not just later on in performance review time, but you show them from the beginning, here's where you're starting, but here's where you can go in our company. That's so important to show that to job seekers. It's one of the main reasons why job seekers leave. And we know this from the work we do at Workforce Partnership. They leave because they don't see they have a future with you. Yes, sometimes they leave because they have a squabble or whatever. But the reality is if they're not working in a way with their supervisor that they can see themselves in 10 years, 5 years, whatever, they're going to leave for $1 more an hour down the street, right? So really important.
And it's something we track month to month. What's our ratio for internal hires? How frequently are managers meeting with their employees one-on-one? We want to make sure that that's a continuous conversation and not a static once-a-year process. It's really a model I feel like has served us well for both that career progression for our employees and also retention has certainly been impacted by that. That's
great. Good stuff. JT, so I want to hear a little bit about, I know you've got some information for us on a probably a little bit higher level scale on how this corporate culture and in particular how that influences our retention, right? And how that can create cost savings. Because I know that there are leaders out there going, oh, this sounds great, but is it really save me money? Am I really going to see a bottom line change by just shifting my culture? And I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's in that field of just corporate culture and even well-being to a point, metrics are tough to come by. You can kind of pick and choose a few different here and there, right, for ROI and for what I like to call VOI, so your value on investment. And but being able to look at that, I think it touches on perfectly what Andrea had just said, talking about how you need to listen to your culture, right? Like, it's not just you telling what your culture is, you need to listen to it, to what's going on and take an honest look at where you're at. So being able to look at things like, your 401k participation, what does that look like? How many people are going in there? Are they financially engaged, right? Whenever you look at that kind of cost savings, a person who's not financially secure spends an average of 2 hours a week during business hours every single week. So 2 hours you're losing every week. So that's over 100 hours throughout the course of the year that you're losing because they're not financially secure. Like that right there is an easy that's an easy dollar to figure out, right? If they're not financially secure. What about retention? Just like Bryan had talked about, which Bryan, I am 100% stealing that retention is the new recruitment. I want you to know that. I wrote that down. I'll give you credit, but I'm stealing that 100%. That's great. So, and even just looking at that, right? So I'm working with a company here in town called ABMA. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that, kind of the jingle that was on there. They just in 5 years of beginning a journey of being able to focus on culture and well-being, just in retention, right? Just in employee turnover, they saved over $2 million in 5 years. They're not a big organization. They're not like the thousands of employees like Bryan was talking about, right? They're a couple hundred. And even whenever they first started, there wasn't even a couple hundred, it was 100. And so being able to look at that and see that impact for, a medium-sized company, that's a lot of money. And so being able to look at not only does it look for, you know, people leaving, coming, but how people are engaged, how people are disengaged. Presenteeism is an issue as well. So being able to look at different factors and track everything that you possibly can, because culture touches on so many different things in there. So it's usually important, but I know that it's something to where all of us need to do better in that area, and we're all kind of working together to try and figure out, okay, so, you know, what is it that we really want to focus on, right? Because you can't try to be able to focus on everything all at once. I mean, that's a tall order to ask anybody. But if you can say, hey, you know what, it looks like we're, again, listening to our culture, we have a turnover issue. How can we address this issue with our culture, right? And looking through that lens of our values, mission, and vision. So.
Great. Oh, thank you very much. $5 million. Oh, no, $2 million in 5 years. I was going to say $5 million in 2 years, which I love that. But
yeah, that if I could provide that type of thing in that small of a company,
small company.
I would put that on like a billboard, right? Like you're going along 435, be like, hey, check this out, like.
Fantastic. No, really great information, because I think it's so important to try to solidify this concept in something other than squishy culture, right? It's a very squishy concept, and to really be able to say, no, there are things you may not be able to measure culture, but you can measure some of the things that culture impacts. And so starting there and listening, like Andrea said, to your, if you do surveying or at least some pulse checks with your employees, those are the best places to start. You're right, JT, like there's so much you could affect, but start where you know there's pain and then work from there, right? I think those are great ideas. So, you know, we talked a little bit about why we should have this great, you know, corporate culture or develop it. We've talked about what are some of the things that it impacts, right? Including bottom line and retention and all of that. But how do we create it? You know, if you either have a company that doesn't really have a personality, or if you have a company that maybe you feel like the culture could use some tweaking and some changing, how do we get to doing that? Is that something that is just dictated? Is that something that is driven as a bottom-up exercise? You know, what does that look like, and what might some of those steps be? And I'm going to go back to JT on this one and have him, you know, share with us his thoughts on, you know, are we top down? Are we bottom up? Are we meet in the middle? What do we do?
Yeah, you know, I'm sure everybody's kind of thinking like, if we could have our druthers, it would be both, right? it would be kind of a sandwich type of approach, but. And you know, and looking at that, right, the law of diffusion tells us that we need at least between 15 to 18% buy-in before it kind of does that tipping point, right? Like before all of a sudden everybody's thinking, you know what, this must be great. Everybody's doing it, that kind of quote, right? Everybody's focusing on this culture. I will say, while I always hope that is the case, where you can have tons of people who are saying, hey, you know what, the culture is the main thing here at the company, right? If that happens, you're one of those top companies to work for, right? You're making those lists, you're winning awards, you're outperforming your competitors in the stock market by a factor of 3, right? Like all these great things that come along with it. But if you're just starting out, right? Like just like you said, if you're looking to build this, what would it be? Like, what is your starting point? And I tell this to every company that I work with, if I could have one thing, just one thing to be able to help affect culture, that's leadership buy-in, without a doubt. Because and I remember whenever I was telling everybody this, whenever we first got together about, this is cheesy, I know it is, please forgive me whenever I say this. It is from Remember the Titans, the movie, but the saying, attitude reflects leadership. And it's true. You know, I've seen it play out time and time and time again. You could have the greatest message, you could have the greatest marketing, you could have the greatest, you know, PR move, you could have somebody who has the best idea for your culture. But if you have leaders who are saying, I don't know if I get it, or, hey, you know what, we're gonna focus actually on work instead of culture, right? Which is a lot of the times what people try and go towards, right? Because we're used to that. It's not that they're actively trying to stop culture, it's just that they're not actively engaging into it. And so being able to have that active engagement and that buy-in from leadership, people say, oh, well, this must have value, because they're focusing on it. They're taking time, they're taking resources, they're taking money, and being able to allocate it towards culture. So we should start paying attention to this. What is this? And then they start having questions. Then you can actually start influencing those employees and saying, hey, this is why we think this is important. We know, we want to know you, we want to care about you, and we want to put resources towards yourself to help you thrive.
Yeah. That's our top layer of the sandwich, right? And so if we're going to have sort of the best of both worlds, right? So that you've got your buy-in from your leadership at the top, but you've also need some grassroots, right? And that is something that I think, Bryan, in your note, I wrote it down that every hire is for you is a new strand in the DNA. That sounds like grassroots to me if I've ever, heard it. So how do you guys sort of try to develop that at that level with your employees, and what does that look like for TVH? Because you've got a variety of different, probably subcultures even within being manufacturing and so forth.
Sure. No, I think it really does start with outreach and recruitment. What we're looking for in a good hire. It's not always the most skilled candidate on the market. We want somebody who wants out of their work and their life the same things that we want, to be a part of in the community. So finding a good value-based fit, as well as I'll drop one more quote, is hire for attitude and train for aptitude. That's something my boss taught me a long time ago, and something where I think we really do want to hire the right person. And if we've got to polish up some skills, we'd rather do that than bring somebody in that's going to be toxic to our environment or our culture. So being really intentional about the selection process, the onboarding process we touched on already, but then the employee support right along that employment journey. We've got a mentor program, a career coaching program, a job shadow program, making sure that people have multiple avenues to build on that engagement and progress forward in their career, as well as the focus on that wellness side. We've got a really robust health and wellness program that I think ties in really well to that employee support side of things. Any corporate communications, when you're sending out a message to 500 or 1,500 people in the building or in our region, you've got to really be conscious of that messaging, right? Everybody needs to be on the same page when it comes to communication, especially with some critical stuff lately on the COVID front. So just being really conscious of what you're sending out and how, making sure that it does keep that people-centric value in mind. And then, the employee progress, whether it's performance reviews or opportunities for cross-training, continuous improvement, professional development is a really big part of our culture as well. So just kind of thinking through those areas when it comes to bringing people into the organization and bringing them along in your organization, making sure that strand of DNA, right, aligns with the rest of the organization and actually helps build and improve it. That's
great. I love it. There's the rest of the sandwich, right? So we can sort of meet somewhere in the middle that makes sense. And Andrea, I know that one of the things that you shared with us last week when we were talking is in so much of these pulse checks that you've been doing particularly, and we'll get to our big COVID question later, I promise. But you guys have seen where leadership has reached out to the people that they supervise and have asked, how are you doing in this very strange time that we're living and working in? And the employees have been so grateful to hear that leadership cared. Maybe share a little bit about that, because that's sort of where the two kind of come together, right? Leadership value and employee value are matching. And I'd love to let you share more about sort of how culture is showing up for you that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I do agree with what JT and Bryan have shared about culture, and that kind of really reinforces what we've been really so flexible in working on the last 4 or 5 months with the impact of COVID, but then also social unrest and how people are feeling at our why. But, our CEO, as well as other leaders, just asking a basic question, how are you? And if someone just gives us kind of the cursory initial response of, oh, I'm fine, it's more of, but no, how are you really? We know there's a lot of things happening in our community. We know there's challenges. And, JT, thanks for that information about kind of the distractor related to someone who's dealing with financial distress. Because again, we do know COVID has impacted people. Maybe they're not impacted at our why, but maybe their spouse or their partner has been impacted. There's something else going on. And so just those genuine type conversations, which I would say genuine is something we strive for as a culture. And being vulnerable is also part of our culture, because that also shows that you're genuine. And so, even if you don't have the same experiences as someone you work with, just the fact that you go out there and you say, hey, I care, I want to hear from you. We've gotten a lot of response back from our staff saying, hey, we appreciate it. And so I encourage, our leaders, even if you're not comfortable doing it, just get out there and start and ask. The other thing we're doing is we're doing pulse checks just to say, hey, we're opening back up. Tell us some of the things that you're worried about in coming back to work. And so it's again, that two-way dialogue, because we do know that our staff are out on the front line, and they're the ones that will have to ensure that we're being, taking those extra steps to be safe, taking those extra steps to be sensitive, that people in general that we serve are on edge as well. And so again, I think that reinforces a culture that, we're continuing to set the tone and set the example from the senior leadership team by being visible, checking in, whether emails, surveys, calls, or in person. And then we're being adaptable. If you would have told me some of the things that we're doing now compared to 6 months ago as an HR professional, I would have told you no way we would be doing these kind of things. But that's just where we are, to create safety and to drive our culture. So, that's one of the things that I was glad that you wanted me to share, was just the fact that I think as leaders, even more so now, we have to be very versatile, and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because I will say I've been very uncomfortable the last several weeks or months, but it's been very important to really drive and set the tone for our culture. So thanks, Keely. Hopefully that was something that you wanted me to share.
Absolutely. And I love throwing my panelists curveballs a little bit. Hopefully you guys are good to go on the fly here. But, just your mentioning of, social unrest, right? We're seeing across the country, the spotlight is now being placed in areas that for far too long have been very dark, right? And these things are bubbling up, and they're bubbling up for people on a very personal level. They're bubbling up for people on a more systemic level. And that, to me, when we're taking that in the context of corporate culture, that makes me think about things around corporate social responsibility, makes me think about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and how do those things impact your culture, help develop your culture. And I'd love, Andrea, if you would speak, a little bit to maybe those types of initiatives, or, those types of things that YMCA has, embraced, or how you feel like, maybe it's just being more intentional about your diverse recruitment, or, I don't know. I just want you to play with that a little bit and share.
Yeah, part of my role is also, helping to develop and facilitate our diversity inclusion global efforts and strategies. And I would say, again, since the unfortunate death of George Floyd, that's been elevated. And, again, just like you said, Keely, this has not been going on just short term. This has been going on for many, years and decades for certain populations of people. I would say with our diversity inclusion efforts, we've continued to do a pulse check, just like I talked about with the other opportunities that are going on, just saying, how are we doing? We've done some, just surveys in the last 3 months. How are we doing related to diversity, inclusion, and global? What can the Y do better? How can we better serve our community? And so we've been asking our 1,700 approximate staff to tell us, you're on the front line again. How do you feel? Do you feel like you're dealing with microaggressions as you interact with your fellow coworkers, or you deal with those that we serve? And if so, how can we help you with that? We focus a lot on leadership development and diplomacy, and how do you work through that? Again, we are a bipartisan organization, so we don't get into the political arena, but, one of the core part of our mission talks about how inclusive our organization is, but then we also focus on the fact that we want to be welcoming for all. And so we talk to our staff a lot about being very diplomatic and using listening skills and not jumping to conclusions. But in reality, many times with bias, that's what you're doing. You're moving so fast that you jump to conclusions, and sometimes it is a fight or flight. But I would say in the wake of everything that's going on, that continues to go on in our community, we've really just focused on building safe spaces for people to have conversations. Even to the point that we've had many people that just want a private space to talk, and they may be tearful. just the different things that are going on in their household or in their community. We may have individuals that are participating in protests, and we do support them in what they want to do. We have different resource groups that create safe spaces. So we have a GLBTQI group, we have a African American, Black resource group, Hispanic, Latino, women leadership, emerging leaders. And we just let them have safe spaces, and we provide support for that group. And then we're there for our members and the children that we serve too. We're in the brink of getting ready for Welcoming Week that's led through Welcoming America, which is a nonprofit based out of Atlanta. And so again, just making sure people in our community know if they're newcomers, whether they're immigrants or just new to the KC area, that they have a space at the Y and we want to welcome them. So hopefully, Keely, that gives you a little bit of idea of what we focus on, but we really focus on education, building understanding. We know that we're going to be on different sides many times, different points of view. People don't have the same experiences, even if they are the same race or ethnic or gender background, but just building a community of understanding and trying to be welcoming to those who want the Y.
So well said, Andrea. Thank you. That was great. And I want to turn to JT, sort of a similar thing. Of course, you serve clients that are companies, right? And so have you had companies reach out to you in recent months asking about how can we do this better? How can we be better at diversity and inclusion and welcoming because either A, our clients are demanding it, our employees are demanding it, or we as leadership feel it's incumbent upon us to just do it. What are you seeing out there with your clients?
Yeah, the one thing that, first off, Andrew, you hit on tons of great points, like phenomenal points. In hearing a lot of things that you're doing, it relates a lot to what I normally tell people is whenever you're looking at diversity and inclusion, you're focusing on a relationship, right? Like you got to go back to that to be able to have that respect for an individual, right? Especially whenever they come from different backgrounds and different, races and ethnicities, and being able to try to develop that empathy, right? And being able to try your best to understand where they're coming from and focus on that relationship. So being able to really provide that knowledge and that safe space and that education around, hey, well, maybe you didn't know this, and here's the reason why you should think about this, right? And then let that set, not necessarily be attacking, but again, focusing on the relationship of because, right, conflict and combat are two very similar things, right? But combat, right, one is two opposing forces where one overtakes the other, right? So there has to be a win-lose. In conflict, which is what we're going through right now, right, that by definition, those are two opposing forces moving closer together. By definition. So what we're trying to do is have this conflict make us better people to be able to understand what others are going through. And so we have to focus on that. It may not be comfortable. It may not be, something that we may, I've heard a lot of people say, well, we've had it, and I think that we're fine with this. It's the status quo isn't where it needs to be. So you are either perpetuating what has happened, or you're actively acting against it. Those are your two sides. Which one would you like to do? And go from there, right? So being able to step in and just say, hey, I might not know everything, but you know what? We're going to learn it together.
Very good. I love that conflict, so often we love as humans to avoid it, right? It's not comfortable.
Yes.
It's not a comfortable space to be in. But to frame it as conflict isn't necessarily combat. But conflict is the coming together closer and closer of two opposing viewpoints or forces. And it means that actually the reason why there's conflict is they're coming closer together, right? And if we can get something good out of this and elevate, then that's a win for everybody. And I love that framing of it that way. It's very good. Bryan, your thoughts on, how diversity and inclusion and equity sort of play into culture with TVH?
Yeah, again, being a global organization, diversity is, part of our fabric. Being in, I don't know how many, 30 or 40 different countries at least. It's something where we are a diverse organization by design and by geography. But the leadership aspect of that, I think we put out some statements as a company in response to recent events, and outside of the employer branding where everyone is welcome and making sure that message is communicated externally. Our CEO put out a letter internally to everyone and just kind of reinforced our stance on diversity and inclusion, mentioned that the company's stance aligns perfectly with his, and even put a note at the bottom that stands out in my mind that if anybody sees this not being respected, to let him personally know. So that leadership buy-in from the top down, even in a large global organization, I think is critical in relation to the culture of diversity and inclusion within an organization.
Great. That's really good. Internal and external communication, right?
Exactly.
So important. So I did promise that we would talk a little bit more about COVID and how this particular, how this virus and our response to it in terms of our work has really challenged probably corporate culture, right? So we now have huge components perhaps of your organization working from home. You may have people on the front lines, like I said, who still have to come into work, and there may be resentment around that or not. So I want to talk a little bit about how coronavirus, with the social distancing, that's another thing. Now we, are around our offices with masks on. We don't get to see each other's facial cues as well. I'm in my office, but I feel very disconnected from my staff, and they're just right next door. We're on phones rather than stopping by each other's office because we're trying to be safe. All of this change that has come so rapidly in just a matter of months. Andrea said there's things she's doing now she never 6 months ago would have ever said yes to, right? As the HR person. What have you been seeing as far as the challenges coronavirus has brought upon your corporate culture, and how are you dealing with that? And anybody can speak up first. Andrea, maybe?
Sure, I'll go ahead and share. And what I was alluding to earlier when I said, if you would have asked me 6 months ago if I would have safety protocols that included us taking the temperatures and a daily health assessment of our associates as well as those we serve, I would have said you were crazy. I wouldn't have said that we would be doing that. But again, we're in a different time right now. I mean, when you're in a pandemic, you're trying to ensure the best practice related to safety and welfare of those that you serve with, but then also those you serve. And so, keep in mind with the YMCA, and I think most times people think of the YMCA as health and wellness. And so the various different membership centers that we have around greater Kansas City area where people can go on their healthy living journey, whether it's aquatics or, workout classes or, weight loss programs or, cancer survivorship, that kind of thing. But in reality, we serve a lot of youth and children. We have a pretty large Head Start program. We have 5 locations in the Kansas City, Missouri area, as well as we do before and after school care and camp. And so especially when you're talking about serving children, which are, parents and families' most prized possessions, you've got to do everything you can to ensure safety and welfare of them, but then also safety and welfare of those we serve. And so, really, we've really focused on, working closely with understanding the CDC guidelines and World Health, as well as local health departments, and learning from others, even individuals within our community, like the Allison-Putman Chamber and others, as well as, just learning from other YMCs across the nation. But what we've done in order to make sure that people feel safe coming is, constant communication. I know, Bryan talked about with the events that happened, with the social unrest and equity issues. We've done the same thing on the COVID side. We've done pulse checks with our members, with the program participants like families, and then also checking in with the individuals that we have partnerships with, like the Head Start programs, just to say, okay, what are best practices for what we need to do? Do we need to change our ratios? One of the things that we changed this year, it used to be our parents and families would come inside and pick up their kids and drop off their children. Well, to limit the access, we determined through input from staff and others that we can make it more convenient for staff, but then also, make it more convenient for our families that we serve, but then also protect our children and the rest of the participants by doing curbside drop off and pickup. So we go pick the child up from the car and take them inside. That way the parent and families don't have to come in. And so we've come up with a lot of our protocols and approach just from input from staff and others. So that collaboration. And so I think that continues to show our culture of collaboration and teamwork is important. The other thing too is making sure that we're being responsible. And I think that continues to reinforce our culture of responsibility. And then respecting people. So no matter if you're an associate who's part-time or someone who's the CEO, your opinion matters because we're trying to be successful during this pandemic. We're doing a lot of check-ins right now. So again, reassuring people in this time of uncertainty. And so we're doing a lot more internal as well as external communication, newsletters that go out a couple times a month to staff. We probably have filmed and pushed out 4 or 5 videos from our CEO, as well as a lot of our training has moved from in-person to virtual. But one of the pluses about that is we've been able to do more virtual training. And then just like with this webinar, we've been able to record and push it out for those folks who can't participate. So I feel like just with the COVID and the pandemic, I feel like we are doing things differently, but I think it's the right things. And we continue to learn because again, our environment continues to change. And then based upon what's changing, we try to adapt it and make sure, and I think it was Bryan who mentioned also that his CEO puts themselves out there that they want to hear from their staff if something's not meeting expectations or if someone is not being welcoming in their environment. And that's the same thing for us related to COVID and our procedures. We want to hear if there's something else that's on your mind. So I'll go ahead and pause there because I know we're getting close to our time and I want to make sure that the rest of the panelists speak. But, thank you so much for the opportunity to share what we're doing related to COVID.
It's so important that as much of a challenge as we all know the situation is with managing staff and making sure we're all still productive during this work from home and the quarantines. And right now the thing that's driving me crazy isn't so much that people in our workforce center getting COVID, but necessarily the exposure to it. And then they have to quarantine for 14 days because the tests are taking 14 days to get back, right? And so how is that business disruption? And that's, it's difficult. But I love to hear that there are ways that you can come together, and COVID has in many ways allowed you to reinforce some of the great values and principles that your culture represents. So things like flexibility, things like collaboration and teamwork, all of these things can actually shine in a time like this. And Bryan, what are you seeing in terms of culture challenges around the COVID and how you guys are having to deal with staff and manage your operations?
Sure. I mean, I think every company's had to make adjustments to their policies, and for us, it's always with the safety and well-being focus. So, our on-site daycare was shut down for a while, and then they put in some screening measures in place. We've got a cafe for our employees, and that's turned into a grab-and-go type of service. So little things like that are, I think, less impactful than having people working from home. We've went into a rotation schedule where we've got 1/3 of the people in each department coming in to keep us spread out and limit exposure, kind of build in that 14-day quarantine if anyone were to have an exposure, a positive test. Location by location, things are different in California and Florida than they are in Kansas, fortunately. So we've had to adjust on a very case-by-case specific method with each location. But I think the biggest things that have been consistent are our communications. We've had an up and going frequently asked questions document where it's updated almost every hour at the beginning of this thing. And now with things like schools resuming, we're having to address issues like that. People are struggling with childcare in their school. Our president here in the Americas also did a vlog where he went around and interviewed employees that we sent it out to the whole company about how they feel and just kind of that check-in. What are we doing? What have we done well? What do we need to do more of or better so that we're constantly addressing new concerns? Something he told me is I've learned through this crisis that we can't over communicate, right? I think transparency and communication is really critical to making people as comfortable as they can be as we navigate through this.
Yeah, that's great. JT, I'm going to give you the last word on this one before we go to some questions. What are you seeing? How is this affecting the way we have to manage culture and I don't know.
It's changed. Right. I mean, everybody knows that, right? It's changed a lot. I think, though, it's important that I think it's just important to be able to look at this in your day-to-day, because it's very easy to kind of get in that spiral, right? Like, well, I don't know what this, and now I got to look at this, and now this, and now I'm getting told this, and the newest COVID numbers just came out, right? It's easy to have that spiral happen. But one thing that I think, just whenever you're looking at it in just that lens of culture, is that your culture's a journey, right? You're never going to arrive. You're never going to just be there and your culture's perfect. Like, you know what? I'm done. I'm out, right? Like nothing like that. It's a journey. It's a mindset. It's something that we are aiming towards. We may hit the mark on some days. We may not. But right now the change is drastic, right? But it's not something that we haven't ever faced before. We face change. Every single one of us has faced change. This one's a little bit quicker, right? And it's a little bit more adaptive, but we've overcome change before. So we all can do this. We all have it in us to be able to handle this. And so being able to look at that from a culture standpoint and be able to have that be your emotional contagion that you give, right? Your strength, and being able to say, you know what? Here's what we do know. Here's what we don't know. Here's how we're moving forward. I think is just a really important thing that a lot of companies, from the companies that I've been able to speak with, have been focusing on a little bit more, rather than just saying, hey, well, we don't know what's going on, right? Just focusing on that positive emotional contagion, rather than, hey, well, kind of deal with it yourself, right? So
That's great. Really, culture is a journey. I think we can kind of end with that, right? It is an ever-evolving process, and it should be. I think that's wonderful. So thank you. I know we're going to take any questions perhaps that we have, but I do want to quickly this has been a wonderful panel. You all are fantastic people. I will be calling on you all regularly now for advice. But either Susie or Shannon, do we have any questions? I'm sure we could all talk for hours about this.
Don't see any open questions. That's what I was double checking, the question and answer in the chat. If anybody does have anything, throw them in there real fast in between. But I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I want to thank Keely, JT, Bryan, and Andrea. It's super informative information. And I'm just as interested, newer to this HR world, as everyone on this. And I want to, again, thank our sponsors, Garmin, Olathe School District, Kansas State University, and Farmers. And I wanted to let everybody know on the call today, this was recorded, the webinar is recorded, and it will be put up on the Olathe Chamber's YouTube channel later this afternoon. And that is, if you just go to YouTube, you can search Olathe Chamber, all one word, and you should be able to find it. And I will also send something out to all of our attendees and registration, the link for today, so they can rewatch this.
Thank you very, very much. It's wonderful. Everyone have a wonderful the rest of your day and your week. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you much.
Thank you guys, all of you.